A multi-system breakdown, a meta-crisis, a polycrisis, is creating pressure from so many different directions. Historically, I think what has happened is that it has come down to the family or your closest friends, the people who show up for you at 4 a.m, the people who help take care of you, to actually take up the slack. And I just am concerned, I guess, around how much more the families and friends can carry. How much can you cover for me? So communication and relationships are delicate, and they're tender, and they're sacred. And you have to be careful.
Nora Bateson is an award-winning filmmaker, research designer, educator, international lecturer,
author, the director of the International Bateson Institute. Nora is kind of in a lineage of systems thinkers.
A distinguished scientific lineage, William Bateson, her grandfather, who gave us the term genetics, and Gregory Bateson.
I work with ecologists and anthropologists. I work with psychologists. I work with artists and educators. My work is about how those fields exist in a context together. That which matters takes time to tend. Time to remember, time to become so intrinsic it is in our bones. It takes air and water and earth and memory. It takes hard work, day in, day out, generation after generation. I am complex. You are complex. When the organism is in a double bind. If I keep doing what I have been doing, I will die. But I don't know how to live in any other way. How do you get out of a double bind? I think it's important to start with thinking about what is communication, and it's a thing that can often get lost in the idea of something like a ping pong game. Like I give a signal and you give a response, and that what is communicated is what is on the transcript. And I can say, see, you said that, and you can say, you didn't say this because it's not on the transcript. But I would like to extend that further into thinking about what communication is beyond the transcript and even beyond our verbal communication. So one thing that I feel is important is to look at the impulse to say, there's things that are wrong with the world, we have to fix those things. And in that, you start to get inspired to go for the parts of a system. But a system is not made in its parts. And pretty quickly, one starts to realize that the system isn't in the education system, it's not in the economy, it's not in the family, it's not in the technology, it's in the relationship between lots of systems, right? Where's the jungle? Is the jungle in the trees? Is it in the soil? Is it in the insects? Is it in the reptiles? Where's the jungle? It's in the relationship between all these different organisms. Okay, so then you might think, all right, if we can't fix the parts, we can work on the relationships. We're going to fix the relationships. But that isn't it either. And pretty quickly, that turns sour when relationships get scripted or pushed into predetermined directions. And then you might ask, well, what makes a relationship? And what makes a relationship is communication. Communication is what makes relationships. Communication is what's making the relationships between all the organisms in a forest or a jungle or an ocean or a family or a society or an organization or a nation or a continent Communication is that process from the molecular level, from the cells in your body making communication with each other, with your gut flora, with the gut flora in communication with the seasons, with the way that your hormones and body is changing, with the way that you, by the time you are actually in verbal communication with another human being, another organism that's made of lots of other organisms, there's communication happening in so many ways simultaneously. It's cultural, it's in gesture, it's emotional, it's intuitive, it's physical, it's coming through multiple processes of assumption, ancestral habits, things we learned in our education. What does it mean to look smart? What does it mean to look vulnerable? What does it mean to not look vulnerable? So what's communication? And I would argue that communication is actually the crux of life. It is our birthright to be in and of and among all of these organisms that are in communication, producing life all the time now. When we think about the ways in which communication is violated, distorted, contorted, twisted, by the things we just do every day, the things we take for granted, advertisement, law, politics, media, and even just habits of courtesy or cultural habits that have to do with, how are you today? I'm fine, thank you, but you're not fine. So does that mean that in clean communication, you should say how you really are? No, not necessarily. But what I am saying is that to purposefully distort communication is to actually be in a kind of interruption of that process which makes life. A lot of us, of course, don't realize that we're doing it. We've grown up and into a world that was premised upon mechanistic thinking. And that is not so easy to point your finger on. And yet, if you notice certainly in English vocabulary, you have words like functional, does it work? You have words that come from Newtonian physics, words like impact, words that are used toward thinking about living systems, but they actually aren't about living systems. That word impact is an interesting one because I think a lot of people use the word hoping that what they're going to be talking about is influence, which is a relational quality, right? But impact is physics. And if you kick a ball, you can measure how far the ball flies, and you can measure the velocity, and you can measure all sorts of aspects of this process. But if I kick a friend, I could measure how far back they fall, but what I can never account for is the change in the relationships that will take generations and will resound through all our mutual friends. The kind of violence that kick represents is a shift in a whole world of relationships and what it's possible to communicate. So for me, I think this question around communication is really, really important right now because it is so easy to think, I just need to say the thing. This is what's on my mind. Everybody's thinking it. I'm going to say it. But when you communicate something, it isn't like you just say a thing and the thing is said. You are producing that thing that's being said from a whole world of cultural assumptions and habits of perception. And the thing that's being said is landing in a context. It's landing in a context. So it's not just some sort of freedom of speech to just say what you want to say. You don't do that when you know that there's going to be relationships that are broken. And so many times, as a parent, I have woken up at, 4:35 in the morning with a kid needing something, thinking, oh my God, remember when I could sleep in? But I do not turn to my child and say, geez, I wish I never had you. Right? Why not? Because that would be probably generations of damage that I could never undo. So communication and relationships are delicate, and they're tender, and they're sacred. And you have to be careful how we nourish them in an ecology of relationships, an ecology of communication. How does what I say make it possible for you to say something else? How does what I say make it impossible for you to say something else? Who can you be? Right? So instead of asking what's on the transcript, who said what, I'm asking the question, what was it possible to communicate? And recognizing that most of our lives are actually shaped by invisible boundaries and limits around what it's possible to communicate. What's it possible for you to communicate in an algebra room? What's it possible for you to communicate when you're in relationship to an elder? What's it possible for you to communicate with a toddler, with your best friend, with your employer? And without realizing it, there are lots of limits to communication. What are those limits? How is our tending to those limits and the possibility of moving those limits part of the process of actually allowing different relationships to take place, for them to assemble in different ways? And communication is sacred. Be careful with it. Intentionally distorting communication is a difficult boundary to draw, because there are ways in which all communication is somehow fueled by an agenda somewhere in you. I want you to like me. I want to be polite. I want to be heard. I want to be taken seriously. I'm trying to get my point across. Like, all of these things could be manipulations. So it's difficult to draw a firm line between communication that is intentionally distorted and unintentionally distorted. But there are also ways in which those distortions can be turned up. And this produces a kind of runaway of mix-ups of relationship and communication that go far beyond that place where the initial communication is taking place. I'll give you an example. So when my father was in the war, in World War II, he had the job of intercepting radio signals between the Axis powers. And his job was to distort them a little bit. So instead of saying the enemy is 36 kilometers away, he would change that a little bit, and it would get transmitted to the troops it was being sent to as the enemy is 5 kilometers away. So the result is that everybody would get all dressed up in all their gear, and they would get all ready to meet the enemy, and they would sit there and they would wait 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 and they wait and they wait. Really? Not a big deal, right? Except that it was a big deal, because what started to happen is that the trust between the soldiers whose work it is to live and die side by side, and their generals and their troops began to erode. And then once that communication begins to erode, then other things that get said no longer have the same weight, the same viability. And so those relationships begin to corrode. So what happens when you distort communication is it erodes relationships. In this era, what we are looking at is a rapid and extreme exponential distortion of communication and relationships in all directions. And the result of that is a corrosion of connectivity, of that tissuing of relationality that makes community, that makes family, that makes love, that makes healing, that makes it possible to nourish and care for each other. That corrosion and that division comes in the form of all sorts of polarization, but it can be more subtle than the left barking at the right or the right barking at the left on the social media. It can happen in your kitchen. It can happen between loved ones very, very easily. And these corrosions then prohibit those people who might otherwise be helping and healing and caring for one another from doing so. So the world of individualism and super effective high-speed communication for particular agendas and goals seemed like it was going to be highly productive. But ultimately, what it's possible to produce or what it's possible to do is what's possible in the relationship. And if it's not possible for you and me and our neighbor to actually get together and harvest onions because we can't talk to each other, how are we going to meet a moment of real disruption in any other sort of format? So these are the moments when it counts to be very, very careful with communication so that it's not just what you say, it's what becomes possible from the way and the way that it's been said and who it's been said to. What does it make possible? What does it make impossible? And that's not looking at the first order. That's looking at the second order, right? I'm not just being nice because I'm supposed to be nice. I'm being nice because a world in which people are kind to each other produces a world in which kindness is a basic premise. And you can't just go around saying everyone has to be kind to each other, because that is a world, that communication itself is a communication of domination, of totalitarianism, of control. Can you see what I mean? So the acts of kindness, the communication of care, speak not just to the care, but to the world being a place where caring is intrinsic. A multi-system breakdown, a meta-crisis, a polycrisis, an omni-crisis, whatever you want to call it. I think the implications are of looking at what happens when there are multiple institutions that are tasked with addressing situations that are beyond their grasp. Let me explain. There's not a problem that we face right now that does not exist as a complex problem. That is, it's not just part of one issue. It cannot be reduced. Even if you have something as simple as, I have a kid that's having trouble with math. All right, so that would appear to be something where what we need to do is get that kid to pass math. So we need a math tutor. He needs, or she needs, they need to have more time with spending with their math class. All right. Is that what's happening? Maybe if you start to look at the complexity even of that one tiny scenario, you start to see that that kid's parents are really having to work so much that they don't have time. That the older sibling did really well in math, and so there's a pressure on the younger one to do really well, and they don't feel up to it. That there is a way in which the school is underfunded and the teachers are not able to get the support that they need. That the math itself is been so abstracted from life that it doesn't resonate with the kid. All of these different processes and possibilities exist in a tiny little moment of my kid's not doing well in math. So when we want to respond to that, what are the ways in which it becomes important to look at the institution, not only of the school, but of economics, of psychology and health, of the family, of politics and law, of the way in which teachers are supported or not supported, of taxes, of right, all of these things come together in the tiniest little gesture of your day, which looks like a kid who's crying while they're doing their math homework. And maybe as a parent, you want to just get that kid to succeed in math so they have the sense of dignity in their identity that they did it. So what's it about? Is it about identity? Is it health? Is it economics? Is it education? Is it politics? Is it culture? Is it intergenerational trauma? Where's the problem? So when we're looking at multi-systemic breakdown, these institutions, none of them can actually address the problem, right? You might have the education department looking at the grades. You could have the legal department looking at how the kid is getting treated at home and if they're actually showing up to school enough. You could have the health department do a scan of their vitals. You could have the psychologist give them a diagnosis. You could have their parents give their version of what's happening. You can have each different context give a read on what's happening with the child. Who saw the child? Who saw the child? This is a microscopic view of what intersystemic pressures look like. But you can also point to everything from insomnia to depression to anxiety to families that are struggling, not only with bankruptcy or high levels of stress, but also with political breaks with other members of the families and with all kinds of crazy stuff happening with their bodies, their microbiomes, their food. And it's easy, all too easy, to point to somebody who is in trouble and to say they made bad choices. And that's why they're in trouble. That's why they're addicted. That's why they're not doing well. That's why they got fired. That's why they failed school. But I would suggest that in this era, it's really important to be cautious about creating singular linear lines of blame and assumption when these pressures from the breakdown of the school system, the breakdown of the health system, the breakdown of the economic system, the breakdown of the political system, and the technological social media madness is creating pressure from so many different directions. Interestingly, historically, I think what has happened is that it has come down to the family or the found family, your closest friends, the people who show up for you at 4 a.m, the people who help take care of you, to actually take up the slack from the damage that this interinstitutional pressure has created. And I just am concerned, I guess, around how much more the families and friends can carry. How much can you cover for me? How much will I cover for you? Who is covering for that kid? Who's covering for the teacher? Who's covering for the parents? Who's covering for the parents' employers who are also pushed beyond their limits? Who's covering for the people who make the clothes that the kid is wearing at school? Who's covering for the people who pick the food that they ate for breakfast? So in intersystemic breakdown, what we are going to see more and more of is very unique but ubiquitous responses of pain, suffering, that all look different. And in one person, it may look like they stop taking care of their body. They stop exercising. And so they lose muscle and they lose conditioning. In another person, it may look like it ends up in a divorce and they lose their partner. In another family, it may look like they suddenly become involved with a sect. In another family, it might look like they become suddenly very wealthy and they can afford things they never had before, but they don't smile anymore. So what it looks like to be in multi-systemic breakdown looks like all different kinds of crises. And I think it's easy to make the mistake of thinking we're looking for a pattern, and that pattern of behavior will tell us, oh, this behavior is the result of intersystemic trauma. No, that's not how it looks. For somebody, it may be that they become extra empathetic and compassionate and give to the point of breakdown. For somebody else, it may look like they totally withdraw. For another person, it may look like rage and violence. So it's important to recognize that this polycrisis, this metacrisis that we are in, manifests in infinite different expressions. A double bind is a term for a particular kind of relationship pattern that that my father identified with a group of people in the 50s. And in this double bind, you have the experience that you cannot win, you cannot get it right. So classically, the double bind looks like a problem that is a problem in more than one context. So the original paper on the double bind uses the example of a child who is trying to give his mother affection, and the mother pushes the child away and says, you need to be independent, so don't come up to me and try to get, all this love and affection, because you need to be independent in this world. And so the kid stays away from his mom. And then the mom says, what, don't you love your mother? Don't you have any affection for me? And so the kid cannot get it right. So then let's extrapolate this into a bigger story, which is sort of the big story of our time, which is that in order to survive, we have to take part in all sorts of establishment systems. We have to be in transportation. We have to buy clothes. We are involved with technology. We're buying things. We're eating things. We're doing things. We're wearing things. We're using things that are actually creating our survival until next month or next year, but are at the same time making it less likely for the survival of our offspring and our offspring's offspring. So in order to get to the future, we're actually engaged in processes that are disrupting the future. Another double bind, classic double bind, is the one where you say, "You never tell me that you love me," to your partner. Or maybe your partner says it to you. And when that happens, there's a predicament. It's a double bind. Because if you say, "Oh yes, I do love you," then somehow that's not sincere, because they shouldn't have had to ask you to say it. It should have been spontaneous. And since they did ask you to say it, how do they know if it's something that should have been spontaneous, that should have bubbled up through you? And if you don't say, "I love you," then they were right. So either way, it comes out that they were right. And what you can't do in that moment is say, "This is a trick question." So the components of a double bind are that you get that to respond to a problem in one context, another problem is created in another context, and there's no way to get out or to say, "Hey, there's a problem here. We're in a double bind." So what do you do? And this double bind, it runs through. We double bind each other all the time. It runs through the culture. Our whole economic world is based on double binds. The notion of efficiency carries a double bind, which is that if we are to create efficient, productive systems, we are going to create disruption in the relationships that make life. So if you hijack the many complex relationships that produce an apple, or a river, what you will do is disrupt the living world. And this is essentially what progress and development has been premised upon. How do you get out of a double bind? And a double bind requires this multi-contextual problem. So strangely, the way that you can get out of a double bind is not by doing what we were taught in school, which is to simplify, but instead to actually add more context or contexts. My father, Gregory Bateson, said, if you want to solve a double bind, you've got to expand the context so that you see the situation in a larger landscape, right? With my work in warm data, I would say if you want to solve a double bind, add more contexts so that you start to see things from other directions. Really, the problem with a double bind is perception. And the crisis perception, the perception that we have in a moment of upset, of outrage, of anger, of sorrow, of despair, of guilt, of any of those things, that perception is very loud. It's very, very difficult to remember in those moments that in order to perceive that situation that is outrageous, that is enraging you, your perception has edited out multiple other contextual perspectives and lots of other contextual information. Breathe. Add context. Look from other angles. Begin to parse through, what does this situation look like? Let's use the situation of the couple with you never tell me that you love me. What does that look like from the perspective of looking at the family's histories and how they expressed affection? What does that look like from the perspective of how you were in your last relationship? What does that look like from the perspective of a world of media in which affection is kind of pre-scripted into a particular kind of expression that may seem so cliche that someone feels silly expressing it? What does that look like in terms of, so you can look from lots of other contexts and start to see the situation in a way that will, I promise you, it will offer possibilities you never thought were there. The problem is that the possibilities that emerge will look nothing like what you thought you were looking for. And so you may not recognize them. They may not fit onto the grant proposal. They may not appear as a solution to this problem when they're actually a response to another whole context that then loosens this problem. Do you see? So there's the way of double binds is the way of ecology. It's looking at how multiple contexts, multiple kinds of communication and relationship create these tangles. And these tangles, on the one hand, are deadly and desperate. And on the other hand, they are a moment of imperative creative movement and learning. So my dad was really influential in bringing the double bind theory into the world. And what he wished for it was that it would be considered as an evolutionary theory, that essentially every organism meets that moment when the things it used to do to survive become deadly. Because all the other organisms are changing. The context is changing. So eventually, every organism has to respond to that. Inevitably, those are moments when the organism is in a double bind. If I keep doing what I have been doing, I will die. But I don't know how to live in any other way. So the only way I can perceive living in another way is to think of some sort of death. All addictions are double binds. How do you get out of a double bind? You add contexts. I have been fascinated for many years in my own research, in my work, with the question of how do systems learn. And I didn't just happen upon this. My father was looking at this question, and his father was. And in fact, people have been for millennia, really wondering, how do systems change? How do they learn? Is changing the same as learning? Are those two words really the same as evolution? And I found in my own research that it became very difficult to place the learning. And I think this disorientation is important for entering into a perception of the complexity that's taking place. So if I ask you, when you're learning to play violin, where is the learning? Is it in the muscles? Is it in the intellect? Is it emotional? Is it connection to the music? Is it in relationship to your violin teacher? Is it in relationship to the instrument itself? Is it cultural? Are you playing fiddle? Are you playing Bach? Are you playing bluegrass? Where is the learning? And I want to pose this in the middle of this question of larger systemic learning, because it's important to recognize that that the learning is taking place in some combination of those things, some combining. And that some days the muscles learn things and can do things that then actually associate over to your intellectual world. And then when you're doing something else that day, you're able to perceive and have ideas in a different way. But also, there is that way in which, if you have a broken heart, those same muscles can actually play the music in a whole different way than they could before your heart was broken. So, where's the learning? All right, now, holding that thought, it becomes important to notice the way in which different aspects of a living system, okay, in this case, we're talking about the body, but we could be talking about a culture, a society, that a living system learns from multiple directions, multiple contexts, multiple different textures, rhythms, resonances, habits of perception, of cognition. And if I say to you, okay, so we have a glass of water here. And well, what is it? Well, it's a glass with water in it. That's all it is. Is it though? What is in the design of the glass and the manufacturing of the glass and the culture? I think this glass came from IKEA. The culture in which IKEA came to be, and the water itself, and the way that it was pulled from the earth, and the mineral base, and the bacteria that come through it, and my own body's need for water. And we could at that point get into a very hot and vibrant discussion about the need to stop the capitalism and the manufacturing and the mass production and the extraction of water and the loss of fresh water on our planet, and that would all be fine. But we could be very distracted from the many other contexts in which this water exists. The feeling of what it feels like to bathe a baby and how their skin is slippery, the notion of your own sweat, your tears, the saliva in your mouth, the way in which water boils and the steam makes prints on the windows when you touch it, the way in which our own relationship and ceremony of our morning shower, the way you get ideas when you're in there. So what I'm pushing here is recognizing that it can be seemingly very laser-pointed, productive discussion on how to save fresh water. But if that discussion and that perception is not holding these other more ancient experiences of ways in which, when I go to the tap and I turn on the water, I'm reminded again and again that I am not meeting my neighbors at the water pump, at the river. We are individuated by the taps in our house, ways we would have met each other. We would have carried each other's water. So there's history, there's technology, there's all sorts of things about our health, our making meaning in life, our notion of life itself is in every single moment of the day, in every single thing that you can interact with. It's there. The practice of perceiving those processes that go beyond this super seductive argument, which you feel like is going to be the linear strategy toward coming up with a concrete solution, but in the process hijacks all of these other ways in which we are in relationship and communication that are actually filled with possibility. When we're looking at systemic learning, the necessity of noticing the deep systemic learning that has taken place, that we are essentially bringing new learning to old learning. And that old learning, for those of us who have been through any kind of school system in the last 150 years, for those of us who have been involved with any kind of world of machines and productivity, the factory, there has been a systemic learning through multiple contexts that has confirmed and reconfirmed and affirmed and reaffirmed the notion of separating out whatever it is you want to look at and optimizing it. Okay, this is essentially the basis of industrialism, modernity. This was the basis of colonialism. This is the basis of getting control of nature, is to break the relationships so that you can perceive and plan out how one piece of a much larger network of relationships can be taken out and controlled and moved to a particular set of outcomes. We see this certainly with the self-help movement. We see it with ideas of what is normalcy. We see it with ideas of success. We see it with productivity, efficiency, etc. But the most important part of this is to recognize that we have internalized that picture of that individuated, isolated is probably a better word, isolated success. And so when we were talking about this glass of water, when we're talking about the glass of water and how we want to fix clean water for the world, that isolation of the topic of water blurs the possibility of perceiving the complexity, which is where all the possibility is sitting. And that habit is something that we don't just do to water. We do it to, let's fix the education system. But the education system isn't in the education system. The education system is culture, it's economy, it's family, it's intergenerational ideas of identity. It's technology. We say we want to fix technology, but technology is not just technology. Technology is culture, it's economy. It's leading back into all of these things that are tangled together. But this impulse to extract, isolate, and control something that we want to fix is exactly the way we got into this mess. And so in order to get out of it, we're going to have to stop doing that, which is actually very, very difficult. It's difficult because we don't even know we're doing it. And it seems so altruistic. It can seem like such the do-gooding thing to do. Even when you ask the question, how do I be a better person? Even when you ask that question, you're isolating the notion of you from the contexts that you live within and the possibilities of being in different kinds of relationship contextually. That question, how do I be a better person? It's linked back to eugenics, back to industrialism, and into this really, factory-oriented notion of how to fix the parts again, instead of the relationship between them, instead of the communication that makes the relationship between the parts. When we say communication is sacred, or there is a call for connection, these are words that can sound sort of, floral and nice. Something that you could stitch on a pillow. But But I think it's important to recognize that this is not just something nice. This is actually life itself. And one of the images that I use to illustrate this is the tomatoes. And I was visiting my friend Rex Weiler at his place in British Columbia, and we were sitting late at night out on his deck, and he said, "I got to show you these tomatoes." And he went and he brought these tomatoes that he had been watching. And there were 4 tomatoes that are separated and they're green. And there are 4 tomatoes that are red and juicy and looking very ripe. These tomatoes all came from the same tomato plant on the same day, and Rex had gathered them up and put them on the table. And over the next couple of days, 4 of them had turned red and 4 of them had not. What was the difference? The difference was that the 4 that ripened, the 4 that became able to learn, if you will, to move, to change, to shift, those 4 are connected by a stem. Even though the stem is disconnected from the plant itself, these 4 tomatoes are still connected. They are still in some kind of communication. Now, clearly, I don't understand tomato communication. I don't know what is happening between those tomatoes, something that is so profoundly analog. But illustrating by contrast that the tomatoes that are isolated remained green. So where was the learning? Where is the development? Where is the becoming? Where is the change? Where is the vitality? Where's the creativity? Where is life? And I think the tomatoes are a pretty good illustration of what this mysterious shared field of communication and relationship is actually holding that we may or may not know. We certainly can't measure it. We certainly can't define it. We certainly don't know the complexities of what's happening in that kind of communication. But I think to pretend that it's not there because you can't measure it is an enormous mistake. What makes me hopeful is that life is ultimately not controllable, and that in that chaos, there is always going to be life making life. As living organisms, we are part of that life making life. So there, I think for me, what I'm looking for and toward is the field of possibilities that are bubbling, waiting in the complex processes that we are not looking at right now because our lens is pointed toward linear solutions onto predetermined solutional processes. But it doesn't really matter because ultimately there are life wants to continue. Life is making life everywhere all the time. And so there are possibilities for that creative process to continue. Whether or not we see them, that's another question. But the possibility, that field of possibilities is there. When Doug Rushkoff was talking about assembling stories, and he was talking about how we have this experience on social media and this experience with our family and this experience in the marketplace and this experience at the bank. And then as living organisms, what we do, because we see relationally, we do all of our cognition through relational process, we will stitch these together. We will assemble them. And so the question is, what are we assembling? What are the experiences that are in these different contexts of our lives? So it's very important to notice that what Doug Rushkoff pointed to were different contexts and different kinds of communication, an ecology of different kinds of communication. And that as ecologies ourselves, we can't help but to make those into a way of perceiving. That's what we do. So in this moment, for me, and this is sort of the basis of my work in warm data, is addressing that question of what are the stories that are being placed as pivots into which that assembling, that combining can take place. Because that actually generates the basis, the premises, the way, the hum of what it is that it makes sense to do in our world. What is it? And the question of what is reality is an important question, because that is a bit of an opportunity for some sort of tyranny to sneak in. What is reality? And the thing is that it isn't. And so if you think about what your hands did 15,000 years ago, your ancestors had hands that weren't so dissimilar from yours. But in their day, they held things, they made things, they touched things, they healed things in ways that are both very similar and very different from the way we are living today. So there's not one way to live. There's not one reality. How do we know how to be in life has to do with these premises that get assembled, that are combining. So what's combining is really important, because that is what is stewing in the premises that later becomes just the basis of action, the basis of our logic. Those points of connection are very, very important. It's always nice to end with a poem, and this is a poem from Combining called Something Has to Matter. What matters continues. Surface distractions and day-to-day transactions are loud. The front part of our lives, but what matters stays below. Something is under us, like a drum beating through us, mattering, mattering, mattering. Perhaps we've not even noticed what matters. I thought I heard him say, "No one has time to wait for the moon. That which matters takes time to tend. Time to remember, time to become so intrinsic it is in our bones. It takes air and water and earth and memory. It takes hard work, day in, day out, generation after generation. That which matters is unsayable in words and is communicated through us. It's in the grain of our wood, in the hum and the song. The patterns of our lives bounce around in a ricochet room, repeating and responding in the same humming grain. Infinity matters in a world of faster, cheaper, more, more, more. The moon has time, and this moment, this meal, this walk, this work, this cup of tea is never to be repeated. It is precious, and it matters what continues. It is the code through which all else will be. It matters.